The morning bell rang loudly in Greenwood High School, echoing through the long hallways filled with the chatter of students. Books clapped shut, sneakers squeaked on the polished floors, and the air was buzzing with the excitement of a new day. Most students hurried to their classes, laughing with friends or rushing to finish homework before the teacher arrived. In the middle of all this noise, a quiet man pushed his cleaning cart down the corridor. His name was David, the school janitor. He wore a plain blue uniform and carried a mop in one hand, while the other hand rested on the handle of the cart filled with brooms, buckets, and cleaning rags. His steps were steady, and his eyes gentle. David had worked at Greenwood High for nearly 10 years. Most students passed by him without a second thought. Some nodded politely, a few offered a small smile, but many simply ignored him as though he was part of the walls. Yet, David never seemed to mind. He greeted each student with the same soft warmth, whether they acknowledged him or not. Every morning, he arrived before the first bus came. He swept the classrooms, emptied trash cans, and polished the hall floors until they shone under the bright school lights. He worked quietly, almost invisibly, yet his presence was everywhere. Without David, the school would not have looked as clean or as welcoming. But to the students, he was just the janitor. To the teachers, he was simply a helper who made sure their classrooms were neat. Very few wondered about his life, his dreams, or what stories he carried within him. That day, however, would not be ordinary. The bell for first period rang, and students hurried into Mr. Miller's classroom. He was a math teacher, tall and sharp-looking, known for his strict rules but also for his sarcastic sense of humor. He enjoyed making his students laugh, even if it sometimes came at someone else's expense. David had just finished mopping outside the classroom door when Mr. Miller noticed him. The janitor was about to move on to the next hallway, but the teacher, perhaps in a playful mood, decided to call him in. "Hey, David," Mr. Miller said with a smirk, tapping the chalkboard where a complicated calculus problem was written. Curves, symbols, and numbers stretched across the board, looking like a foreign language to many of the students. "Why don't you come in here and solve this? Let's see if you can beat my top students." The room burst into laughter. A few students whispered to each other, giggling at the thought. Some looked at David with pity, others with curiosity. After all, he was the janitor. What could he possibly know about calculus? David paused at the doorway. His kind brown eyes shifted from the teacher to the chalkboard, and then to the rows of students staring at him. He could have smiled politely and walked away. He could have said, "That's not my job," and continued with his mop and bucket. But instead, David did something no one expected. He stepped inside the classroom. The students grew silent, surprised by his calmness. David walked slowly toward the chalkboard, his work shoes making faint thuds on the floor. He picked up a piece of chalk from the tray, holding it between fingers that were more used to scrubbing and sweeping than writing on boards. Mr. Miller chuckled, thinking it was still part of the joke. "Take your time, David. Don't worry, we won't grade you," he said lightly. But David was not laughing. His eyes studied the equation with quiet focus. For a moment, he simply stood there, motionless, while the classroom waited. The students expected him to put the chalk down in embarrassment, or maybe to scribble something silly. Yet, there was a stillness in his expression, a deep, thoughtful stillness, as though the numbers and symbols were not strange to him at all. One student, a girl named Maria, leaned forward on her desk. She noticed something the others did not, the way David's lips moved slightly, as if he were whispering the steps of the problem to himself. His hand trembled for just a second, then grew steady. He turned back to the class. "Do you mind if I try?" he asked softly. No one answered. They were too stunned. Mr. Miller raised an eyebrow but said nothing. David faced the board again, lifted the chalk, and gently placed the first line of his solution beneath the problem. The faint scratching sound of chalk on the board filled the silence. Outside the window, the schoolyard was alive with movement. Birds flew past, the flag swayed in the wind, and cars rolled into the parking lot inside. However, time seemed to freeze. Every eye was fixed on the janitor who, for the first time in all these years, was not sweeping the floor but standing at the front of the class like a teacher. The laughter had died out. The smiles faded. Even Mr. Miller crossed his arms, uncertain of what to expect. David did not rush. He moved carefully, step by step, as though each number and symbol carried weight. His handwriting was simple but clear. His focus was unbroken. And though no one realized it yet, something extraordinary was about to happen in that quiet classroom, something that would not only change the way they looked at David but would also teach them a lesson they would never forget. The classroom was silent, more silent than it had ever been before. The chalk squeaked softly against the green board as David wrote the first line of his solution. His movements were slow, almost cautious, but there was a confidence in the way he placed each number, each symbol. The students stared at him, their curiosity growing with every second. At first, some thought it was just luck, that maybe he remembered a trick from long ago. But as the steps began to connect, the silence turned into amazement. Mr. Miller, still leaning against his desk, tried to hide his surprise. He had given the class one of the hardest problems from the calculus textbook. Most of his students hadn't been able to finish it the day before. He expected David to laugh, wave his hands, and walk away. Yet here was the janitor, calmly solving it as though it was second nature. "Is he actually doing it?" whispered one student in the back. "Looks like it," Maria murmured, her eyes wide as she followed each stroke of chalk on the board. David paused for a moment, wiping his fingers on the side of his uniform. His face showed no pride, no sign of trying to prove anyone wrong. Instead, there was only quiet focus, like a man returning to something he once loved but had been away from for too long. He wrote another step, then another, breaking the problem into smaller, manageable pieces. The more he worked, the clearer it became that he knew exactly what he was doing. The once laughing students now leaned forward in their seats, as if they were watching something rare and important. Finally, after several minutes, David placed the chalk down gently on the tray. He stepped back from the board, his hands folded in front of him. "There," he said softly. "That should be the answer." The classroom erupted into whispers. "No way," one boy muttered. "That's exactly what I got when I used the calculator yesterday," another said in disbelief. "Wait, did he just solve that faster than all of us?" Maria was the first to clap, her hands breaking the silence. Slowly, others joined in, though some were still too stunned to react. Mr. Miller stood frozen for a moment. His sarcastic smile had vanished, replaced by something harder to read, part surprise, part discomfort. He walked over to the board, scanning the solution carefully. His finger followed each step, line by line. At last, he cleared his throat. "Well," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "it appears, you solved it correctly." Gasps echoed around the room. The students looked at David differently now. Just minutes ago, he had been the man with the mop, the one they hardly noticed in the hallways. Now, he stood in front of them like a hidden scholar, someone who carried knowledge far beyond what they had imagined. David simply smiled, a gentle curve of his lips, and reached for the rag in his pocket. "I didn't mean to interrupt your lesson," he said kindly. "I'll let you continue." He turned to leave, pushing his cart toward the door. But before he stepped out, Maria raised her hand quickly. "Wait," she said, her voice eager. Could you show us how you thought about it? Like, the steps you imagined before you started?" Other students nodded. They weren't laughing anymore, they were curious, even hungry to understand what had just happened. David stopped at the doorway, his back still facing the class. For a moment, he seemed unsure. Teaching wasn't his job anymore. His duty was to clean, to keep the school in order. But as he turned around and saw their eyes filled with respect instead of dismissal, something stirred inside him. He walked back slowly, this time not as a janitor, but as a man with knowledge to share. Math is like a story, David began, standing by the board again. His voice was calm, almost soothing. When you read a story, you don't jump to the ending right away. You go step by step, from the beginning to the middle, and then the end makes sense. A math problem is the same. The students listened closely. For the first time, some of them understood the problem in a way the textbook had never explained. David's method was simple, clear, and full of patience. He explained how he broke down the large equation into smaller parts, how each step led naturally to the next. Maria's face lit up with understanding. Even the boys at the back, who usually doodled in their notebooks, were nodding along. Mr. Miller watched in silence, his arms crossed. He wasn't sure what to say. He had brought David in as a joke, but the joke had turned into something else, something he hadn't planned for. After a few minutes, David placed the chalk down again. "That's all there is to it," he said. "It only looks scary at first. But when you take it one step at a time, it becomes simple." The bell rang, signaling the end of class. Students gathered their books, but their conversations were no longer about homework or lunch. Instead, they whispered about David. "Did you see how fast he solved it? He explained it better than the teacher. I never thought he knew anything about math." David quietly pushed his cart out of the room, heading back to his work. His footsteps faded into the hallway. Yet in the classroom, the impression he left behind was stronger than anything the students had expected. For the first time, they saw him not as just a janitor but as someone far greater, a man who carried hidden wisdom. And though no one said it out loud, they all felt it, something important had just begun. The next day, whispers about what had happened in Mr. Miller's class spread like wildfire through Greenwood High School. In the cafeteria, students leaned across tables, retelling the story in their own way. In the hallways, they exchanged amazed glances whenever David passed by with his cleaning cart. "Is it true? Did he really solve it?" one boy asked. "Not only solved it," another replied, "he explained it better than the teacher." Even those who hadn't been in the classroom the day before seemed to know every detail. They talked about how calm David looked, how steady his hand was when he wrote on the board, and how his solution had left the class stunned. David, however, remained the same. He carried out his duties with the same quiet dedication. He mopped the floors, emptied the bins, and polished the windows, just as he always had. If the attention bothered him or pleased him, he didn't show it. He greeted the students politely and offered his gentle smile whenever someone thanked him. But inside the classrooms, a change had begun. Students who once thought of math as a monster now looked at it differently. They remembered the way David compared math to a story, how he spoke about patience and breaking things into small steps. Something about his simple words gave them hope. By the third day, curiosity had grown too strong to ignore. When Mr. Miller entered his class, he noticed the eager faces staring back at him. They were not looking at him the same way as before. There was expectation in their eyes. "Sir," one student blurted out before the lesson began, "will David come again today?" The class chuckled, but it wasn't in mockery, it was in anticipation. Mr. Miller stiffened. He had not planned to involve David again. After all, he was the teacher, not the janitor. Yet, seeing the students' interest, he felt trapped. "I don't think that's necessary," Mr. Miller said firmly. "Now, open your textbooks. We'll continue where we left off." But fate had its own plans. As Mr. Miller wrote another challenging problem on the board, the classroom door creaked open. David entered quietly, holding a dustpan and broom. He hadn't come for the math lesson, he was just doing his daily cleaning round. Yet the timing was perfect. The students exchanged quick, excited glances. Maria raised her hand immediately. "Sir, maybe David could look at this one too." The room erupted in agreement. Even those who were usually silent found themselves nodding. Mr. Miller hesitated. His pride battled with the request. He didn't want to be outshone in his own classroom again. But with so many eyes waiting, he finally sighed. "Fine," he muttered. "David, if you'd like, you may take a look." David set the broom against the wall and walked toward the board. Once again, the room grew still, as if the very air was holding its breath. The chalk rested in the tray, waiting for him. He picked it up gently, and the scratching sound returned as he wrote the first step. The silence was so deep that every mark of the chalk seemed to echo. One by one, David worked through the problem. His pace was calm, never rushed, as though he was listening to a rhythm only he could hear. The students leaned forward in their chairs, their notebooks forgotten. As the solution grew on the board, so did the respect in their eyes. Some whispered softly to each other, "He makes it look so easy. It's like he's teaching, not just solving." Mr. Miller stood behind his desk, arms crossed tightly. His face gave away nothing, but inside, he felt an uneasiness he hadn't known before. For years, he had been the authority on mathematics in the school. Now a janitor was earning more admiration in minutes than he had in months. Still, he could not deny what he saw. The steps were correct, the logic flawless. At last, David placed the chalk down. He stepped aside, his handwriting filling nearly half the board. "There," he said quietly, the same way he had the first time. "That's the answer." The silence stretched longer this time. Not a single student moved. They just stared at the board, as though it held some kind of secret. It was Maria who broke the silence again. "Can you explain how you saw it?" she asked softly. David nodded. "When I first looked at it," he began, "I didn't see one big problem. I saw many small problems hidden inside. If you take them apart and handle them one by one, the large problem becomes less frightening." His words were simple, yet they sank deep. The students scribbled notes, not of numbers this time, but of his advice. "It's like life, too," David added, almost as an afterthought. "We all face things that feel too big, too heavy. But if we take them step by step, they become manageable." The classroom was silent again, but this time, it was not an empty silence. It was full of thought, respect, and something new, admiration. When the bell rang, the students didn't rush out as usual. Instead, many stayed behind for a moment longer, staring at David with a sense of wonder. As he picked up his broom and dustpan, a boy from the back called out, "Thank you, sir." David paused. It had been years since anyone in a classroom had called him sir. His eyes softened, and he gave a small nod before leaving. Behind him, the classroom remained hushed, the chalkboard still carrying his solution like a reminder. The silence of the board told its own story of hidden knowledge, quiet strength, and respect that was slowly changing the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. And though no one could fully explain it, they all sensed that this was more than just math. Something deeper was unfolding at Greenwood High, and it had only just begun. The next morning, the city woke up to a storm. The video of Maya's humiliation had gone beyond social media chatter. It had reached newspapers, television channels, and online platforms around the world. Headlines were everywhere: "Calm woman insulted in store, her silence speaks louder than words." Others wrote, "A powerful example of grace in public humiliation." At first, no one knew who she was. The story was carried simply as an ordinary woman mistreated by a store manager. But the mystery made the world even more curious. People replayed the clip again and again, trying to understand the woman who stood so tall and calm even when insulted. Her silence became the most powerful statement. By the afternoon, journalists began uncovering her identity. When the name Maya Roberts appeared, the story exploded with even greater force. Suddenly, this was not just a customer. This was the CEO of one of the most powerful investment firms in the country, managing billions in assets. 5 billion under her control, one financial magazine declared. And yet, she was treated like nothing. The contrast shook people deeply. How could someone of such status be humiliated so casually? But the truth was, people were not only reacting because she was rich and powerful. They were reacting because she represented something universal: the pain of being disrespected, the courage of staying calm, and the strength of walking away without lowering herself. While the world argued, tweeted, and wrote articles, Maya sat quietly in her office. Her phone rang constantly. Business partners called to express concern, friends left messages of support, and journalists demanded interviews. Clara, her assistant, tried to manage the flood of attention. Maya, the media is outside, Clara said gently. They want to hear from you. Everyone wants a statement. Maya placed her pen down and looked out the window. The city skyline stretched before her, tall buildings glowing under the afternoon sun. Not yet, she said softly. Clara hesitated. But the chain is under fire already. Their headquarters has released a short statement calling it an unfortunate incident. People are angry. They want more. Maya turned her eyes back to Clara. Her expression was calm, almost unreadable. Let them want. Silence has its own power. Meanwhile, the retail chain was drowning in backlash. Customers boycotted their stores, online reviews flooded with criticism, and shareholders demanded answers. The company's leaders rushed into meetings, arguing about damage control. Should they fire Alan publicly? Should they release an apology? Should they try to meet with the woman in the video? But they did not yet realize the depth of the storm. Inside their offices, reports arrived about sales dropping sharply in just one day. Families refused to shop there. Some suppliers called, worried about the company's image. What had seemed like a single incident was becoming a national crisis. Alan, the store manager, was also facing consequences. Reporters camped outside his home, cameras flashing. Neighbors avoided him. He gave short statements like, "It was a misunderstanding," but no one listened. He had become the face of disrespect. Back in her office, Maya was not interested in his excuses. Her thoughts were on something far greater. She knew this was not just about her, or one store, or even one company. It was about values. It was about how people deserved to be treated. And she held in her hands not just personal dignity, but the power to teach a lesson the world would not forget. That evening, she gathered her board of directors for a private meeting. They sat around the polished wooden table, each of them aware of the global attention on their leader. Maya, one director began, the whole world is waiting for your response. This could be the moment to speak publicly. Your voice could inspire millions. Maya folded her hands neatly on the table. Her eyes moved slowly across the room. Words are powerful, yes, she said. But sometimes actions speak louder. The world doesn't need another speech. The world needs an example. There was silence. The directors exchanged glances. They knew Maya well enough to understand that when she spoke like this, something big was about to happen. Gather the reports on every investment we have in that retail chain, Maya continued. I want the full details of their stock, their debt, their partnerships. We will review everything tonight. One director gasped softly. Maya, are you thinking of pulling out? Maya's eyes were steady. Not thinking. Deciding. The room grew tense. The weight of her words filled the air. Pulling her company's investments from the chain would not just hurt them financially, it would shake their entire foundation. Billions were tied to her decisions. Sometimes, Maya said firmly, the best way to remind the world about respect is to show them the cost of disrespect. The directors fell silent, realizing they were witnessing the beginning of something historic. As night fell over the city, news outlets speculated endlessly. Was Maya going to speak? Would she sue the company? Would she forgive them? No one knew. But Maya herself was calm. She sat by her window, sipping tea, the quiet city lights reflecting in her eyes. The world was restless, but she was patient. She had waited her whole life to rise from silence into strength. And now, she would use that strength not with noise, but with action. The storm was only growing, and the world had no idea what Maya was about to do next. The world had waited for 3 long days. Every newspaper, every television channel, and every social media platform was filled with the same question: what will Maya Roberts do? Her silence had only added to the suspense. The retail chain had already begun to bleed. Customers were boycotting stores, protests formed outside their branches, and shareholders grew restless. But no one could predict the step Maya was preparing to take. On the 4th morning, Maya called a press conference. Invitations went out to major media outlets, business leaders, and community voices. By the time the event began, the hall was filled to capacity. Cameras lined the back, microphones crowded the podium, and millions around the world tuned in live. Maya entered the room with her usual grace. She wore a black suit with a white blouse, simple yet commanding. She did not smile, but her calm presence drew silence from the noisy hall. She stood behind the podium, placed her notes neatly in front of her, and looked directly into the cameras. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady. "Many of you know what happened a few days ago. A manager of a retail store chose to insult and humiliate me in front of others. I did not respond with anger. I did not raise my voice. I simply walked away." Her words echoed in the hall. No one moved. "But walking away does not mean forgetting," Maya continued. "It does not mean accepting. Respect is not a luxury. It is a basic right for every human being, whether they are a customer, an employee, or a leader. And when that respect is denied, it must come with consequences." She paused, letting the words sink in. The cameras zoomed closer. "As CEO of Roberts Investments, I am announcing today that we will be pulling all of our funds from the retail chain responsible for this incident. Our investments, valued at $5 billion, will be fully withdrawn over the next week. We will no longer support a company that fails to value dignity and humanity." Gasps filled the room. Journalists scribbled notes furiously, cameras flashed, and whispers rushed across the hall. $5 billion. The number was so large it felt like an earthquake shaking the business world. Maya continued without flinching. "This decision is not personal revenge. It is a message. A message that no matter how large a company is, it cannot survive if it forgets the simple principle of respect. To every person who has ever been treated as less, I want you to know, you are not less. And you never will be." The hall erupted in applause. For the first time, people in the audience stood on their feet, clapping not just for her words, but for her courage. Maya remained composed, bowing her head slightly before leaving the stage. Within minutes, the news spread like wildfire. Maya Roberts pulls $5 billion from retail giant. Stock markets reacted immediately. The retail chain's shares plunged, losing billions in value in a single day. Investors panicked, suppliers called for emergency meetings, and employees worried about the future. At the headquarters of the retail company, chaos broke out. Executives argued in their boardroom, voices raised, papers scattered. "We need to apologize again," one shouted. "We must reach out to her," another cried. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Alan, the store manager at the center of it all, sat alone in his small office. His phone buzzed with calls from reporters, but he did not answer. His name was now linked forever with the fall of a chain once thought too big to fail. For the first time, he realized the weight of a single careless act. Outside, ordinary people celebrated Maya's decision. For them, it was more than business. It was a story of justice. A woman had stood tall, not with anger, but with principle. Her action gave hope to millions who had ever felt powerless in the face of disrespect. In homes, parents told their children about her. Teachers discussed her speech in classrooms. Community leaders praised her as a model of dignity and strength. Across social media, hashtags like #RespectIsPower and #MayaRoberts trended worldwide. Back in her office, Maya sat quietly, watching the news unfold. Clara, her assistant, entered with tears in her eyes. "Maya, people are calling you a hero. They're saying you gave them courage." Maya shook her head gently. "I'm not a hero, Clara. I am only a reminder. A reminder that silence has power, and action has consequence." She leaned back in her chair, her gaze calm but firm. The storm outside was fierce, but within her, there was peace. She had made her decision not out of anger, but out of principle. And that made all the difference. The retail chain had not yet collapsed, but the cracks were deepening. Every hour brought new reports of falling sales, fleeing investors, and angry customers. The countdown had begun. Maya sipped her tea slowly, her eyes focused on the horizon. She knew this was only the beginning. The real lesson for the world was still unfolding. The fallout came faster than anyone expected. Just 2 days after Maya's announcement, the retail chain's stock price dropped again. Investors were no longer willing to risk their money. Banks started reviewing loans, suppliers began canceling contracts, and customers continued to boycott the stores. What had once been one of the largest and most trusted retail companies in the country was now struggling to survive. News anchors spoke of it every hour. $5 billion pulled overnight. The chain's future uncertain. How one woman's decision shook an empire. Inside the company's headquarters, the atmosphere was frantic. Executives sat around a long table, their faces pale and tired. Piles of reports covered the table, each one showing losses greater than the last. "We're down 30% in sales in just 1 week, one executive said, his voice heavy. "Investors are leaving faster than we can respond," another added. "Some of our biggest partners have already backed out." The CEO of the retail chain, a man named Richard, buried his head in his hands. He had built the company over decades, but now, in just a few days, its foundation was crumbling. "How did this happen?" he whispered. "How could one moment destroy us like this?" The answer was simple, but no one wanted to say it aloud: disrespect. Meanwhile, Alan sat in his small apartment, unable to escape the storm. The world now knew his name. The videos of his act had been replayed millions of times, and everywhere he went, people recognized him. He avoided the streets, kept his curtains closed, and shut off his phone. He thought back to that day in the store, to the moment he had raised his hand in arrogance. He had wanted to show authority, to feel powerful in front of others. But instead, he had destroyed not only his own career but also shaken an entire company. For the first time, he realized that respect was not about titles, uniforms, or authority. It was about humanity. And he had failed. Across the country, ordinary people continued to celebrate Maya's decision. Families who had felt ignored by big companies found hope in her action. Employees in small businesses shared her speech with one another, saying, "This is how a leader should stand." Children watched her calm strength and learned a lesson their textbooks could not teach. One teacher wrote on the blackboard for her students, respect is free, but the lack of it can cost everything. She told them Maya's story as an example of grace and power. At the same time, small shop owners began to see an increase in customers. People who had once gone to the big chain were now turning to local businesses. If they can't treat people with respect, one customer said, why should we give them our money? The chain tried to fight back. They released new statements of apology, fired Alan publicly, and promised training programs for their staff. But the damage was already done. People had lost trust. And trust, once broken, was almost impossible to repair. One evening, in a quiet meeting room, Richard, the CEO of the chain, spoke to his board. His voice was heavy with regret. We forgot the simple truth, he admitted. We thought success was about numbers. But we forgot the people behind those numbers. And now, the cost is too high. Back in her office, Maya watched these events unfold with calm silence. Clara, her assistant, came in with the latest reports. The chain is collapsing, Maya. Their stock is at its lowest in years. People are saying this is your victory. Maya looked up slowly. This is not victory, Clara. This is a lesson. Victory is when no one has to go through humiliation to be reminded of respect. Clara nodded, tears shining in her eyes. She admired Maya's strength, but even more, she admired her heart. That night, Maya received thousands of letters and emails from strangers. Some wrote of how they had faced similar disrespect and found courage in her silence. Others wrote about how her decision inspired them to believe in themselves. One young girl wrote simply, "Thank you for showing me that being quiet does not mean being weak." Maya read each letter carefully. Her heart was moved, but she also felt a deeper responsibility. The world was watching her, not just for what she had done, but for what she would do next. Meanwhile, Alan finally stepped outside one evening. He walked down the quiet street, his head bowed. For the first time in many years, he felt small not because others made him feel that way, but because he understood how wrong he had been. The sound of children laughing nearby reminded him of the innocence he had damaged in that store when they watched him act without respect. He whispered to himself, I can't change the past, but maybe I can change myself. The chain continued to fall. Store after store reported losses, and branches began closing. What had seemed impossible just a month ago was now reality. A giant was crumbling, not because of market competition, not because of economic crisis, but because of one truth: dignity cannot be ignored. And in the center of it all was Maya Roberts, the woman who had chosen silence when others expected anger, and action when others expected silence. The world waited to see what she would do next, but Maya was not in a rush. She knew some lessons take time to be understood. The fall of the chain was not the end. It was only the beginning of a new way of thinking. Weeks passed, and the storm that had begun in one store grew into a turning point for the entire country. The retail chain that had once seemed untouchable was now closing its doors in city after city. Store windows that once displayed bright signs now carried notices of out of business or closing soon. Employees searched for new jobs, investors accepted their losses, and suppliers moved on to other partners. The company's final collapse was announced on a quiet Monday morning. News channels reported the headline with a mix of disbelief and certainty: retail giant declares bankruptcy after historic withdrawal. What had taken decades to build had fallen in less than a month. Across the country, people shook their heads in amazement. Some felt sympathy for the employees who lost their jobs. Others saw the fall as just a reminder that even the biggest institutions could fail if they forgot the simple value of treating people with respect. In his small apartment, Alan sat alone when he heard the announcement on television. His eyes were tired, and his face carried the weight of regret. He thought back to the day in the store, to the moment when he had chosen arrogance over kindness. One action, one careless gesture, had sparked the fall of an empire. He whispered to himself, if only I had treated her with respect. If only I had remembered she was a person, not just a customer. Alan knew he could not undo what he had done. But for the first time in his life, he wanted to change. He began volunteering at a local shelter, helping people carry groceries and listening to their stories. He spoke to young workers about the importance of humility and kindness. Though the world still saw him as the man who destroyed a chain, he quietly worked to rebuild himself, piece by piece. Meanwhile, Maya continued her life with the same calm grace she had always carried. The collapse of the chain had brought her worldwide recognition. She was invited to give speeches at conferences, honored by universities, and praised by leaders. But Maya did not let the attention change her. She refused many interviews, choosing instead to focus on her work and her values. One evening, as she sat in her garden with a cup of tea, Clara joined her. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Maya, Clara said softly, the whole world calls you a symbol of strength. They say you brought down a giant with silence. How do you feel about it? Maya looked at the horizon. Her expression was calm, but her eyes carried a depth of thought. Clara, I did not bring down a giant. The chain destroyed itself the moment it chose arrogance over respect. I was only the mirror that showed the world what was already broken. Clara nodded slowly. She knew Maya's words were true. Maya continued, this was never about money. It was never about revenge. It was about dignity. If even one child looks at this story and learns that they deserve respect, then all of this was worth it. In the weeks that followed, letters continued to arrive at Maya's office. One came from a young boy who wrote, when I am teased at school, I remember your story. I stand tall and stay silent, because I know silence can be strong. Another came from a woman who had worked in a small shop for years. She wrote, you showed me that my voice matters, even if I don't shout. Maya read these letters with a quiet smile. To her, these messages were the true victory, not the fall of a chain, but the rise of hope in people's hearts. The world slowly moved on, as it always does. New stories filled the headlines, new events captured attention. But the story of Maya Roberts remained in the memory of millions. It was retold in classrooms, in workplaces, in homes. It became a lesson parents shared with their children: treat everyone with respect, because you never know who they are, and more importantly, because every person deserves it. Years later, the building that once held the chain's largest store was replaced by a community center. It offered free classes for children, career guidance for young adults, and support for struggling families. Many saw it as symbolic: where once people had been disrespected, now dignity was being restored. Maya visited the center quietly one afternoon. She walked through the halls, watching children laugh and families gather. No one recognized her at first, and that was how she preferred it. She did not need applause. She only needed to see that the world was learning. As she left, a little girl ran up to her and said, Miss, thank you for helping us. Maya knelt down, smiled gently, and replied, remember, respect yourself always. That is where your strength begins. The girl nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. Maya stood, walking toward her car as the evening sun cast a warm glow across the street. She carried no pride, no bitterness, only peace. She had faced humiliation, but she had turned it into a lesson for the world. And that lesson was simple: dignity cannot be bought, but once lost, it can cost everything. Maya Roberts had not just pulled $5 billion from a company. She had pulled the curtain back on a truth humanity too often forgot. Respect is not optional. It is essential.